So I'm going to come right out and say it. I am a community college instructor, and I'm tired of folks bashing community colleges. And I myself am a product of the community college. Some of my best friends are also products of the community college. Many of my friends that started at community college have gone on to get PhDs, and they've done it while accumulating much less debt than other folks. Um, but there seems, and maybe it's just my perspective, but there seems to be, especially in kind of what's going on in the higher ed and prison world, um, some beef between four-year institutions and community colleges. Um, and I think community colleges are great, and I just want to throw that out there and let you know that that's where I'm coming from. This last piece, well, anyways, I don't want to take up too much time, and I think I might have overbooked myself to begin with. So as we've already discussed, this dialogue between Castro and Braun is kind of a foundational piece for me as well. And one of the things that makes it so awesome is that, you know, Braun, as an incarcerated student, is having this really robust, interesting dialogue with one of his former professors. And I think that's going to be like a touchstone that I'm probably going to keep coming back to throughout my presentation. So I think if you're in this talk, you probably are familiar with who Paulo Freire is. But there's another character that is, you know, somebody who's pretty key to liberatory pedagogy. And I find that we don't talk about him nearly as much. And if you want to drop in the chat, I'm really curious if folks are familiar with Horton. And wherever you are and whether you know about him or not, I'm gonna talk a little bit about him. Um, I like this book cover because it kind of puts them as adversarial. But if we look at some of the other pictures of their interactions, just like the joy that is present in them being together is pretty amazing. And kind of how their relationship started is so Horton predates Frary by, I think, a decade or two. But they ended up being at the same conferences a lot of the time because their interests overlapped so much, and eventually they came to be really good friends. And Frary himself felt that Horton was not kind of getting as much acclaim as he deserved. So he called him up one day and he said, "Miles, let's talk a book," which is supposedly exactly how he said it. And basically the proposal was that he would come to Highlander, which is this place that Miles Horton co-founded, which I'm going to talk about in a moment. And they ended up spending 6 days together, and they just hung out and chatted, and their conversation was recorded. And then, you know, the multiple other folks that are listed on this cover edited it all together into this book, which is a fascinating, interesting read. If you are a Frary fan, he talks about lots of stuff about his evolution as a scholar that I haven't seen in a lot of other places. So I thought that was really interesting. So Miles Horton was this guy who both Horton, I think one of the things that makes their pedagogical approaches so interesting, and they have what gives them so many commonalities, is that growing up they both dealt with crushing poverty. And Miles went on, he went to school, and then afterwards, since he was always obsessed with this idea of like, how do we help people escape poverty? How do we help people see the systems that oppress them? He started the Highlander Folk School, which is now known as the Highlander Research and Education Center. The first thing that Highlander did, which was pretty extreme, was they were a huge player in the labor movement in the 30s, and like would go from basically like shop to shop trying to get people to organize and to help build collective power. And I mean, even though now we exist in a terrifying anti-union climate, um, why we had such an impressive um, union organization at one time was in a big part because of Miles Horton and the work of the Highlander School and the folks that he worked with. And then if you have heard of Miles Horton before, you've probably heard of the role that he played in the civil rights movement. Him and Highlander trained Rosa Parks. They worked with MLK. They worked with John Lewis. They trained lots of members of SNCC. And of course, this resulted in like lots of propaganda and smear campaigns and things like this. Also, one of the things that had Highlander in the news fairly recently was they were firebombed by, I think, by that white supremacists because they found some white supremacist graffiti a couple of years ago. Here's Rosa Parks also at Highlander. And so one of the things that they had that Frey and Horton had in common was this belief in that if you actually sit down and talk with the people that are involved in these oppressive situations, that a lot of the times they know what they want. And if you actually talk with them and don't infantilize them and don't lord over them your educational superiority, they will actually kind of express the things that they're most looking to gain, either through political and social action or education or the combination of the two. And part of why I spend so much time talking about Horton was because still I think he deserves to get a little bit more attention than he's currently getting. But I think some of his principles and like the ways that he goes about organizing and doing things with students, I think we know that Ferry has kind of like a complicated relationship with authority, where in classroom situations, in some of his writings, it seems like you should be an authoritarian, and Miles Horton was much more kind of self-effacing when trying to organize folks. And I think that because our students in the prison already have to deal with so much oppressive authority, I partially feel like Horton's approach might be a little bit more applicable. All right, so I'm going to spend some time, and Logan, if I'm getting over time, put the smack down on me. I wanted to tell folks a little bit about my attempts to incorporate some of this pedagogy into my practice as a prison educator. And I mean, this was I've been teaching at the college level now for about a decade. This is one of my favorite classes that I've taught ever. And it took place in the spring semester of last year. So this is a sophomore level comp class. One of the things that made this class super special and super interesting was that it was during the final semester of a cohort program. And so these students had been taking all of their classes together for 5 semesters, and they were also housed in a dedicated housing unit that was specifically for this AA. Something that is kind of important to draw attention to as well, and I think one of the things that made the program so effective was that the students were actually paid for class time and homework time. Now they were still paid prison wages, which are atrocious, but why they decided that they had to do this was because the prison that I was working in also has a pretty big industry program, and they came to the realization, kind of like what Selena was talking about, that if they had the choice between making money and taking classes, they were going to go with making money. So in order to try and shift that dynamic a little bit, they were like, well, we're only paying them $3 an hour anyways. Why don't we just pay them to actually take the classes? And then there was a dedicated tutor who was totally awesome, that was actually a graduate of the previous cohort. Man, I miss these guys. Prepping for this presentation has made me take a walk down memory lane that has made me a little teary-eyed more than once. So in my attempts to try to do this anti-authoritarian, collaborative, hopefully liberatory space, these were the moves that I made in the class. From day one, I told students, I was like, I want you to be co-creators of what we do in this classroom. And right away, I had them start with some brainstorming. I'm going to skip that second point for a second. So we brainstormed two things starting on that first day. And because why I had to do this on the first day was because of the inherent time lag in teaching in the prison. I was only in there once a week, and as I hope will become clear, in order to get things moving, I had to start immediately. This constructing and negotiating the rules of the classroom, I felt that that was really important. Some students in the class, a lot of them started out as very confused. And this is part of where the title of my presentation comes from. They're like, why should we make the rules? You're the teacher, you make the rules. I was like, no, like this is part of, so the institution that I was teaching in was a medium security prison. And something that else that's going to come up later in my presentation is because of the rules of the DOC at this particular facility, students are not allowed to take higher ed classes until they're within 5 years of release. So I did have the privilege of being able to try and get students to think about what things are going to be like post-release. And part of how I tried to make this negotiation of the rules something that hopefully think would be worthwhile was by saying like, look, once you're out, you're not hopefully going to have too many people putting their finger on you and telling you what to do. And I know that there's, definitely lots of issues with that and supervised release and all that stuff, but hopefully you know what I'm talking about. One of the other things that I wanted to think about in that class was our constraints and affordances. As we know, I think the constraints in teaching higher ed in prison are many, and they're terrible and completely unjust. But I really wanted to try and go in with then more of an abundance mindset. And instead of focusing on all this negativity, I was like, what are the things that are actually somewhat of a privilege in this space? And kind of like what Michael Braun was talking about, he talks about spending 2.5 years putting together his critique of Freire, right? That, even though, look, I am a prison abolitionist, I'm not afraid to come out and say that. But within the constraints of what we're working with here and with our students that are incarcerated, I think there is a way in which we can think of the time, even though it's criminal, as a privilege. And anyways, I gotta wrap up, I think. How am I for time, Logan? All right, I'm gonna blast through. My apologies here. One of the things that I think can make the prison teaching experience so rewarding is that our students have so much experience. They've done a lot of things. They've seen a lot of stuff. Pros and cons for sure, but they are situated in their personhood in a way that at least my free world students like often are not. And I think that that is really a strength that we can draw upon. And I think because I've attempted to do liberatory pedagogy stuff um, to some degree in quite a few of my classes, both inside and outside the prison. And I think it actually works better in the prison. And I think a lot of that has to do with like the affordances that we have in there, or at least the affordances that I've experienced. Um, so one of the things that Braun talks about, that one of his big breaking points in that article, which I recommend that all of you check out if you haven't already, is the teacher being the person that controls the information automatically leads to this authoritarian situation. So how I tried to break out of that was by I have I have like our library staff is not huge, but our librarians at Inver Hills are totally awesome. And I was in a meeting one day and I was really complaining about how students don't have access to a ton of materials. And one of my librarians was like, well, we can find that for you. That's part of our job. So about maybe a third of the way through the course, I have, even though the final research paper is the last thing that we work on, I have them make a decision um, by the end of about the first third of the course, so that I can put their requests into the hands of our librarians, and they can actually find the materials for them to do their research. And this helps break that like, oh, I'm the owner of the knowledge dynamic. Um, the facility that I've worked in, we don't have any internet access, but I know for some people that might be an option. That even though it was a little long, that part by Braun where he was talking about having his sisters do the research for them, for some people, if they have that outside support, that can be huge. And it also worked really well in my class. Not everybody had access to that, but the ones that did, it also served as like a social proof for them. So they could show their friends and family, like, look, I'm in here, I'm incarcerated, but damn it, I'm going to get this education and you're going to help me. And a lot of them spoke really highly about that. The other thing that, and this is one of those areas where my students educated me, is that we had this thing called Rachel, which some people call internet in a box. And it has the full Wikipedia. It's got hundreds of TED Talks. It's got lots of articles and papers, and it's completely separated from the internet. Um, so if, I mean, then the catch is like, will they be able um, to use the computer that is connected to Rachel? Anyways, all these things served to kind of like flatten the hierarchy of the instructor being the person that controls the information. And then I'm gonna. So I had some students say that the class was tremendously valuable. COVID things got crazy. Um, this guy, I don't know. He loved that COVID happened because he had kind of an antagonistic relationship with a lot of the other students in the class. Um, this is a little cut off. Um, this guy was born premature, so he says that he had the lungs of an 80-year-old. However, the DOC did not consider this a serious medical condition. Um, so yeah, COVID definitely threw a wrench in a lot of things. I guess here's my wrap up. Yeah, I thought that the resistance was actually really, once we got over that initial um, hump, that it was actually super productive. I don't think that this class would have been this successful if it hadn't been the cohort model. So if you are in a position where you can advocate for a cohort model, I I would definitely recommend it. I think, I don't know, a lot of us know that really we can trust our students, even though the DOC says that they're going to manipulate you. At least that's what my DOC training did. I think that if we build that reciprocal trust, that it can be a really important relationship. And one of the things that really ticks me off about my program is that students can't start until this 5-year window, and I think it would be a lot better if they could start earlier.